Alarming reports today that a Chinese spy ship spent at least 3 weeks off the Australian coast collecting intelligence earlier this year. It's believed the vessel spent time monitoring a military training area in Shoalwater Bay in Queensland. The ship, considered to have extensive surveillance capability on board, also passed training areas used by our Royal Australian Air Force. It's a clear case of the CCP flagrantly spying on our capabilities, but it begs the question, what exactly was China looking for, and how did they go undetected for so long, or did they? For more on this, I'm joined by the Director of Defence, Strategy and National Security at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Michael Shoebridge. Well, thank you for your time, Michael. In the last 2 months alone, China have threatened Australia with serious attacks, they've said. They've threatened us with nuclear strikes. Now we find out this spy ship was sitting off our coast for a good 3 months. Not a surprise to you or me. This has happened in the past, but what do we know about this particular episode?
Well, Peter, this follows a similar ship observing the major US-Australian joint exercise, Talisman Sabre, that happened recently. And it's one of these ships that is like an electronic vacuum cleaner. What they're after are all the electronic and acoustic signals of Australian ships, planes, missiles, radars and facilities, because the Chinese use those to tune their own missiles and weapon systems to evade, counter and damage other militaries like the Australian. So it's a known thing that they do, but they're getting more present more often around Australia, as we're seeing here.
And I presume they wouldn't have been breaching any UN regulations about territorial sea waters. They would have been where they could be, but as close up to our sea border as they can be.
Well, Peter, that's right. That's a very interesting thing. So they stayed outside our 12 nautical mile territorial waters. So they were operating in accordance with international law. But unlike the Chinese Coast Guard or maritime militia, our Navy didn't water cannon or harass the vessel, not like we've seen the Chinese do in the last week to 2 Philippine ships in the South China Sea. So we're abiding by the international law of the sea in letting China operate unharassed in our exclusive economic zone. And we'd like to see China do the same with the Philippines, Vietnam, and other vessels and militaries in the South China Sea. That's really part of this bigger picture.
Well, I covered his speech in detail at the top of the show, but I'm keen to see what you made of Peter Dutton's remarks. Pretty forthright. In particular, I think his response to former Prime Minister Paul Keating. Keating has responded, of course, with a statement, but Peter Dutton didn't miss.
No, well, a lot of people don't have time to read lengthy reports about the Chinese military and the Chinese government's use of their military, whether it's the Pentagon's report on Chinese military power or a big report by a Dutch think tank recently. But Peter Dutton saved them the trouble. He gave them a whole lot of clear, grounded facts about Chinese military capability and the use of that capability to intimidate and coerce others. So I think his speech was grounded in fact. It's a bit disturbing that former Prime Minister Paul Keating doesn't seem to recognise these facts, but then the kind of treatment he's had from Chinese leaders with over 10 years on China's Development Bank's International Advisory Board probably has given him a different view of Chinese behaviour than, say, those Philippines ships that were water cannoned recently.
I'd encourage people to go to the Defence Minister's website, defence.gov.au, if you want to read the speech in full. I think, like Michael makes a point there, it's full of facts and they're good to read. Talk to me about this plan that was dropped, a bit of consternation inside the coalition about it. The government was going to build a very long runway in Antarctica. Now, the fact that they're not going to do it now, people like Erica Best, Tasmanian MP, says this means we will basically be giving up Antarctica to the Chinese, perhaps even the Russians. What do you think, Michael?
I think access to Antarctica is fundamentally important. All-weather access with an all-weather runway is getting more important as Antarctica warms and the conditions become more difficult if you don't have an all-weather runway. There are other ways of accessing Antarctica, but I think it's a mistake not to invest in our future down there. And we've seen when we don't act, others will. And I'm using we in the bigger sense of the democratic powers in the world. So it's much better for Australia and our partners to build access to Antarctica than to see that being done by powers whose interests we don't share. And you've mentioned Russia and China as the big ones. So I'd love to see the decision revisited, because I think Antarctic research and also security would be enabled by this all-weather runway.
Look, that were the arguments put on the table as to why we needed to do it. And of course, Bob Brown, the foundation, had a big fight against it. The government, whether it's kowtowed because of that or other reasons, I'm not entirely sure, but they've pulled out of it now. And I agree with you, it should be revisited. I want to go, just before we finish, Interpol recruited 2 new members to their board. A Chinese official was elected to Interpol's executive committee, and an Emirati general, Ahmed Nasser al-Raisi, who's been accused of torture, but he's still been elected president of Interpol for a 4-year term. Now, I don't know, a serious Chinese player and someone accused of torture. What are they doing on Interpol?
Well, Peter, this fits a pattern with Interpol. The Chinese had the first Chinese head of Interpol a little while ago, and he got secretly arrested and detained by the Chinese government, and he's now been charged and is going to spend a lot of time in Chinese jails. Just what for, we're not quite sure, because that's the Chinese legal system for you. So having another senior Chinese person on the board and someone else whose reputation looks pretty tarnished, it's no way to run an international policing organisation. The real problem here is that the Chinese government are trying to extend their domestic law to operate internationally, extraterritorially, things like their national security law in Hong Kong. So if someone criticises the Chinese government over Hong Kong, as I will now, they're doing incredibly brutal repression there, they're subject to that national security law, and China would like that to apply, making what I've said here an offence that they could prosecute me for. So enabling them to work through Interpol and have more power in Interpol is fundamentally against the purposes of that organisation. We need to buy back into that international organisation and encourage other democratic powers to do so too.
Spot on, and it would concern me, given those 2 players are now in very senior roles, the exchange of information that goes through Interpol and how secure that is. Michael Shoebridge, all pretty worrying tonight. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.